came to Vietnam as boys, from farms, cities, rural America. They fought in an unpopular war. Many never returned. Those who did were greeted with despair and hatred. Today, these Navy Seabees returned to Vietnam for many different reasons.
I've talked about doing this for probably 15 years. I've always told people someday I would like to go back to Vietnam. Never really thinking I would. It was like a safe thing to say. I want to do this, but in my mind I knew I wouldn't. So it was a nice thing to say.
But I've always said I didn't want to come back. And I thought long and hard for about 2 weeks. And I said, if those World War II vets can do it, I can do it.
It's something I've wanted to do for a long time. It felt good to come back. I really wanted to get back up to Khe Sanh, which is where I spent most of my time.
Visiting my daughter, and I mentioned it to her, and she says, well, you've mentioned you might want to go sometime. She says, you're not getting any younger, so if you want to do this, you better maybe think about going.
I think a lot of them did it for themselves, and more importantly, they did it for all of the other Seabees and other men who couldn't come, didn't want to come, and for those who are no longer with us. But I think there's a sense of community, a brotherhood, that everyone is here, even though we're 11 individuals. I think those 11 individuals were actually 27,000, which is how many Seabees served. And beyond that is everyone else who served.
Some prefer not to talk about their experiences and have no desire to go back to Vietnam. Others do. They want to go back. They feel the need to remember, to visit the battlefields, the bases, and locations that are now the history of the Seabees in Vietnam. What was it like as an 18-year-old in Vietnam, and now a 60-something veteran? This is what we will discover when the Seabees return to Vietnam. They come from Wisconsin, Washington, Michigan, Florida, New York, Colorado, California, Nebraska, Ohio, Pennsylvania. This time not carrying sea bags, but carrying memories. Some good, some bad. Private memories begin to be remembered and documented when Vietnam veterans gather. On a Veterans Day in Washington, D.C., several former U.S. Navy Seabees gathered to honor those who have died, those who were living, and those who have remained in hiding. The idea of returning to Vietnam became a reality through a non-profit group, Vietnam Battlefield Tours.
Directly across the river, you see the flagpole for the Citadel.
Welcome to Vietnam to all of the U.S. Navy. I love it to present you to be here in my homeland.
They stepped off the plane in Hanoi, a city at one time that was an enemy territory in North Vietnam.
There's a lot to do tomorrow. It's going to be really compressed. You won't get a lot of time to spend there at all these places.
They had several tour guides on this trip, and what proved to be very advantageous when trying to navigate the country.
Welcome Hanoi with the new airport. This location, the new one.
So what we're going to do this morning is we're going to walk that street, and it's going to take us half hour, 45 minutes to walk. It took them about 10 days to fight their way those 10 days. So we're going to point out some things along the way to give you a sense of what they were dealing with.
The monsoon rains brought back memories, good and bad, to these U.S. Navy Seabees. One of the first stops on this tour was the Hanoi Hilton, a spot where many prisoners of war were held, tortured, and some died. They came to discover that the Hanoi Hilton had been a prison for many centuries.
I feel it'd be like an old prison. I've seen pictures of a cell and whatnot, but I didn't really know.
John McCain's cell was proudly displayed by the Vietnamese tour guide. Of course, all of the displays in language is seen through the eyes of the Vietnamese. Several Navy Seabees noted discrepancies in their commentary.
The Marines had to fight their way into through these rooms, battle room to room. Every foot of the inch they had to fight their way across. The Marines were in one courtyard, NVA was in the other courtyard, and they were shooting mortars up over the wall to come down to the other courtyard.
It's all different. I don't remember it being so hilly. And I don't remember the water over here. I just remember us being out on a nice flat plain and we could see the mountains way over here. Had our perimeter set up all the way around. I bet we're standing right in the middle of our company compound though, but I'm not sure.
The pagoda was located between two Seabee camps, CBMU 301 and Camp Rhodes, which was home to several different battalions at different times. As near as we can tell, what was now both Seabee camps is a very large Buddhist monastery, and we did in fact find the location of where this pagoda was. It was another instance of coming home, if you will.
But I used to walk over here from 301. I used to see the statue. And by the way, it was every time I passed it, it gave me such a peaceful, serene moment. And then I would pass this water, or goldfish in here, and I'd walk over this way to the battalion where they had a chow hall, we didn't. So it was like a couple of times a day. And I remember, and this is about the size it was. The female Buddha sat right up here on the high ground. That wasn't there, and this wasn't there.
For the last couple of months, once I decided to go, I was kind of a little anxious in some ways, wondering what I'm going to do. And everybody I told I was going, the question most of them had was, why? You know, like, why would you ever want to do that? But I don't know. I've lost a few friends there, and it just seemed like a good time to go back. It could be a healing time, and talking to Gene and Tex, some of our guides said that they'd lost a lot of guys, and it really was a healing experience. And so I thought that might be a good thing to do, and just put a few ghosts to rest and enjoy the country this time.
Came through here, this was a stopping point midway up to Khe Sanh. I was here before the siege, and I came back up here again, probably late May, early June of '68. And I came up here 2 or 3 times and were turned around. We couldn't go on up to Khe Sanh because the NBA was still holding the territory up there. These ridges are a lot closer than I remember, but it makes sense why they picked this spot for an ambush. I mean, this was just, you came down this road, you crossed that bridge, and there's the other side of it. That's the road. Right in this area is where I was at when I started taking fire. I only remember the fire coming from up here, but it was from both sides, I was later told.
When we stayed at the hotel in Dang Ha, which is built right next to what is called the Dang Ha YCU ramp, where supplies would come in to supply all of the servicemen of what is called Northern I Corps. Our road gravel that we used on our road construction project would come into the Dang Ha ramp by barge. I looked out the hotel window, and my gosh, the ramp is still being used as a ramp, and they're still bringing gravel where I almost wanted to walk down there and ask if I could help them measure the piles. That was a pretty awesome moment.
The bases that we were at weren't there anymore, of course. It was cities, concrete buildings, no longer thatched huts. boulevards with painted lines down the middle, flowers and trees, and a very beautiful country. Lots of greenery, quite unlike what we remember from 1968 and 69. Much like 47 years ago when the young Navy Seabees boarded the plane for South Vietnam, many were 18, 19, 20-year-olds.
Yeah, for me, it's kind of like returning to your old neighborhood, you know? Come over here, 19 years old, naive Midwest kid. Grew up here.
The first thing I remember was the smells. I have never smelled a place like this, and that's not a derogatory statement, but there was very, very little in the terms of military cantonments. We lived in tents, and I remember the smell of the rice paddies every morning when the wind was drafting across. I also remember that the Vietnamese were very, very hard-working people, and on that first deployment, we didn't use them in the camp. There was a concern about security and other issues, so we only saw them from a distance. But they always waved and the kids always smiled when we were going by on the trucks. So those were my initial impressions.
I remember a couple of things vividly. We were about an hour out of Da Nang on the airplane, and the pilot picked up AFVN radio and he piped it through the plane.
AFVN plays more music.
And the very first song that came on was Sugar, Sugar.
Sugar.
I hear that song and it takes me right back to that C-141 sitting in rear-facing seats about an hour out of Da Nang. We landed in the early morning, I would say 3, 4 o'clock, that kind of time frame, and we were standing in line to change our American dollars for the monopoly type MPC or military payment certificates that we all had to use. And way off in the distance there was some thumping from incoming rockets. And those of us that were new, our first time, I mean, we just took off running for the nearest bunker. And the guys in line, my friends who were there for their second tour, seemed to sense that it was way off at the other end of the base, no problem. They just moved to the front of the line, and when we all came out of the bunker, they were at the front of the line, we were at the back. But that first early morning, that incoming coming in was my realization that this is the real deal. This is the real deal. People are shooting at us. We arrived, our final destination was Quang Tri Combat Base, so maybe about 7 or 8 in the morning, we boarded several C-130 propeller transports, flew out of Da Nang up to Quang Tri, and you know, I stepped off into the heat and the humidity.
Some were curious. Others didn't know what to expect. Some were well prepared for this journey back in time to a land that has changed so much. Many locations were unrecognizable by the group. There was never a permanent Seabee camp at either Camp Carroll or Quang Viet, but many Seabees served at both as detachments. The naval base at Quang Viet is now a Vietnamese Coast Guard base. Like many locations, it was hard to recognize what was once Camp Carroll. The site is now a tapioca and rubber plantation. The Seabees even crossed from what was South Vietnam to North Vietnam over the Hai Long Bridge at the DMZ.
A year ago, I would have never thought about doing this. And when I finally read on the internet about great crews trying to get Seabees to go back to Vietnam as a group, I thought, well, why not? They're all people that have experienced similar things that I have done. And I looked at it and said, if World War II vets can go back to Normandy, can go back to Iwo Jima, and go over things that they've done, I said, I can do it too.
They came armed with Google Maps, maps of the actual combat bases, pictures taken back in the 60s, and memories that they would find were not quite as accurate as they remember.
You know, the hooches were set up in wagon wheel sections. So there was Charlie Company, Delta Company, Alpha, Bravo, and it was kind of one big wagon wheel around with showers in the middle. The first cab was like over there. There were bunkers over here, and the runway had to be over there.
I expected to be able to recognize something, but 47 years later, there really wasn't anything. You could kind of make out where the runway used to be. But I thought, 47 years later, I expected it to be different, but I thought I could, recognize something. And from Quang Tri to Dong Ha, that was open country, and it's pretty much urban now. There's not really any open country between Dong Ha and Quang Tri.
The Seabees built Wonder Arches at Chu Lai. The Wonder Arches were originally designed for use as underground passageways and storage areas in Antarctica. They worked so well, the Seabees decided to bring them with them to Vietnam, where they came into widespread use as aircraft shelters.
We didn't spend a whole lot of time here at the airstrip. We just built the crosswind runway, and then we were gone back to other things.
It was surprising to many the friendliness of the Vietnamese, both the adults and the children. Outside of one school, the children kept asking the Seabees their names and wanting to have their picture taken with them.
What's your name?
Dennis. Dennis.
It was much different 47 years ago, when children would sometimes carry grenades and toss them at U.S. servicemen. Google Maps were invaluable when trying to locate the sites of former combat bases at Quang Tri and Dong Ha. There were several locations that were very recognizable, like the airport at Quang Tri. It is still a large flat area as seen from the air, the footprint of the airport. Standing on the ground, you could see the runway locations along with many deep bomb craters. The runways were constructed of interlocking sheets of metal. Some were smooth, others corrugated. Many, if not all, of the air bases in Vietnam were constructed and maintained by Navy Seabees. Another landing strip that was still recognizable was Khe Sanh. The trip to this former combat base and landing zone would prove to be the most emotional for these Navy Seabees, two of whom survived the siege of Khe Sanh. The major battles of the Vietnam War were Ap Bac, La Drang, Khe Sanh, the 1968 Tet Offensive, Hamburger Hill, the fall of Saigon, and Xuan Loc. To most who served in Vietnam, even the smallest encounter with the enemy was a major battle. Our Seabees on this return to Vietnam included several who fought in the battle at Khe Sanh, referred to them as the siege. The Battle of Khe Sanh began at 0530 hours on the 21st of January 1968.
On January 21st, they purposely hit the base at sometime early morning and shelled the base continuously for almost 4 to 5 hours, at which point we realized we were in one hell of a fight. And that went on. The siege of Khe Sanh lasted 77 days till it was lifted in April. The main purpose of the Seabees on the base, our group, was to repair the runway. Runway got hit every day, 2-3 times a day, sometimes more. And it was the lifeline for supplies, because in the first in the first days of the siege, the NVA had managed to destroy the ammo dump, supplies that had been laying out. We had work to do, and you survive by chance. You would hear around, quickly footed yourself over into a bunker, and hopefully that bunker would not get hit. I did not understand the politics, did not understand the mechanics of the war or anything else.
Visit to Khe Sanh was as emotional as it can ever get. There was a sense that I'm not sure how to explain it, but it was to walk through there again.
When you and I first met, they would actually get back here?
No, absolutely not. This is never on my bucket list. This is something that just came about in the last year or two. So, just in a need to do.
The ghosts were still there. I had a feeling that all the guys were still there. And the finality of the whole thing, and I don't think, the reality is that I probably will never get over that. That time there was an unbelievable time. There wasn't, I don't feel that I did anything special. I did my job. I think all the guys did their job. And we did what we were told to do. For us, it was nothing special. It was just the place that turned out to be what it was, the siege of Khe Sanh, which for us, we left it. It wasn't a siege to us, it was just a job. And that's all it was a job to us.
It's, you know, it's not as tough as I thought it would be. But yeah, it is tough. A lot of people died up here on both sides.
We buried, we're members of the Khe Sanh Veterans Association. We took a small patch from the Khe Sanh Veterans Association as well as the Seabee insignia, and it's buried about 25 feet in front of the nose of the C-130 that they had parked on the old airstrip. We lost, out of our original group, we lost 2. Charles Billman was shot down on his way back to Khe Sanh, went down in the valley along the river, and then Cody Adams caught a piece of shrapnel right around Easter, if I'm not mistaken, in 1968. Had a lot of wounded, but we were fortunate. I remember Khe Sanh as being small, but not as small as it is. And when you take into consideration that they said the number of rounds we took was between 1,000 and 1,500 rounds of artillery rocket and artillery rocket and mortar rounds every day for 77 days, and you look at the size of that place, you kind of wonder how you ever got out. You know, a truce was signed in Paris, but for us as individuals to meet some of the old North Vietnamese soldiers, some of the ARVN, ARVNs, but as well as the Viet Cong. It's nice to go back and particularly up in the mountains around Khe Sanh. When we first got there, it was green, lush forest. When we left, it was a moonscape, and now it's a green, lush forest again. While most of the wildlife is missing, the jungle has returned.
They hit the ammo dump first time out, they'd call back and say, hey, right on, dump it. And then they used to walk them down the line. They were very good at walking them up and down the line. So, yeah, they were very good at it. I'd say, you know, they didn't sleep through their classes at artillery school. They had this runway hit. This runway got hit almost every day. We used to get up and go, God, it would be one day they would love if they just missed.
Yeah, you go up, push the damaged matting out of the way with one of the dozers or the cherry picker, and you'd place 2 on the opposite side. The runway was like a trough. It was linked together, and you could just push the damaged runway out, and then fill it with gravel, refill it, and then push new matting back in. And it was ready to go. Yeah. Yes. How much of the red was from blood?
That was the end. And you can see the runway actually went out, almost out to that. Somewhere near that building there, I think, is where the runway ended.
Yeah. And when they would come in from the east, they just dropped those damn things. It's just like they stalled them and dropped down, hit this runway. They'd run down to the west end, make a turnaround. The door would come down. The door would be down after they hit the ground, And as they were making the turnaround, everybody off the right side of the aircraft, people going on the left side. As soon as he got back out here, lock them up, fire up the engines, and away you go.
The visit to Khe Sanh was absolutely heart-wrenching for a couple of the guys who survived the battle. But to walk on that plateau, to see that red dirt, to feel that what was the landing strip, knowing the stories behind it all. And we had to be careful where we walked because there's still a lot of ordnance out there that is not exploded. So you have to be careful where you're walking. Still to this day, that's 47 years later.
People have asked me why I'm doing this. You know, I can't put into words for them why. It's just has become terribly important. And to walk the road that I walked 40 years ago, to see the approximate site of the places I lived, what was home, pretty awesome, pretty awesome.
I can't believe we actually found one of the students that was in the school here, and he recognized several of the trees, so that was wonderful. It means a lot to me. This trip is kind of completing a circle for me, and I'd like to say a few words about why I came back. And why I came back is for one of my best friends, a guy named Bill Covington. Bill Covington and I spent 4 years together at the Naval Academy. We spent 2 years together at Georgia Tech getting our masters. We both went to the Civil Engineer Corps Officers School about the same time in Port Hueneme. And through a quirk of fate, we were both assigned to, I was in MCB 74 and he was assigned here in Da Nang. I had been in country less than 3 weeks and had planned on coming up and see Bill. We did this about once a week and flew back down to Chulai. And on this particular day in December of 1968, I missed that flight up here. I was manifested on it, but my CO wanted me to stay down in Chulai because there was a lot of rain coming. So I missed that flight, but Bill got on the flight up there and took off on a CH-46 with I think it was 18 or 20 other people, and never arrived. And Bill went into a MIA status for 13 months. And then in July of that year, I deployed back again for my third deployment up at Quang Tri. And I got a radio message one night in February that said Bill's aircraft had been found. They had all been killed, but the remains had been recovered. But at the last reunion, I went to Bill's widow, Charlotte, showed up. And we talked, had a very emotional relation. I said, you know, Charlotte, I'm going to go back to Vietnam. And that's why I went on this tour, because I want to report back to Charlotte. I've closed the loop between Bill and I. Short story.
NVA were in that building across the street.
The tour was guided by a representative of Vietnam Battlefield Tours. This nonprofit organization specializes in bringing back U.S. soldiers to Vietnam. The 11 Navy Seabees were not interested in souvenirs. They were interested in seeing what their bases, locations, and structures look like today. There would be some disappointment, some elation, and sometimes more questions.
MCB-4 Seabees, Ron Harrison, Marty Blakely, who lost their life 20 May 1968 when their truck drove off the bridge and they were drowned. Their friend, close friend, Dave Strand, commissioned 2 Seabee Challenge coins with their names on it to be placed in the river for all eternity. Can do, Seabees, you're not forgotten.
Waited a long time for this. I really did. I always tried to imagine what it was like today. Now I know. I'm glad I came.
Somewhere right about in here would be the cross to go over into the camp, into the Camp Barnes.
Yeah.
cross
You're right,
over the
because
barns.
we go downhill.
Yeah, and right about where that road is, you go downhill.
The
and
mess hall
barns
was right back here.
was down a little bit to the right.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. I think we're about as close as we're going to find it.
I think so as well.
Today, driving down to Da Nang from Dong Ha, we traveled through Quang Tri City again, and I had brought a photograph of just south of our combat base that I had taken 45 years ago. I was hoping I would find that same spot, and sure enough I did. I said to our driver, can we stop here? He let me out, and I took a present day photo of the exact same shot. It's a picture overlooking a shallow river type area with a railroad bridge in the background, in the far background. In my original picture, it's a French built bridge that had been blown up by the Viet Cong. In my picture I took today, it's a modern replacement bridge. But I came here hoping I would find that spot, and I did.
Another location that was confirmed was the former site of the American Forces Vietnam radio station in Quang Tri. One of the things that I had a chance to do was to help build an Armed Forces Vietnam radio station in Quang Tri. And we had absolutely no experience building towers, no experience in doing a lot of things. But we did. We put it together. We managed to get generators. We put a radio station, an AM station on the air. We managed to put a television station on the air to kind of bring to the troops a little sense of home. I actually did a morning show when we were not under attack. I did a morning show from 6 o'clock till 9 o'clock in the morning.
This is AFVN 93 in Quang Tri.
American Forces Vietnam Network.
So we went back to look to see if the station was there. We knew it wouldn't be. So we used a Google map to try to find the place where the tower was, the radio station was. And I managed to remember enough of it, what the road was like, so we found it. And there was a house there. So we asked the Papa Son if there was ever a radio tower here, and he said, yeah, there was. And he said, as a matter of fact, there's a huge piece of concrete that is underneath our house that we couldn't move. And I said, that was the base of our tower.
When they dug down to make the foundation for the house, they found that.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's so strong, so they left it. So mình thả đó.
But it was amazing to stand there, and the guys all stood behind me, and they looked around, and they could see. That's probably the one moment that if there's ever a tear in my eye, it would be that, to be standing there in that location. To me, that's what fulfilled what I wanted to do with the trip. That was my one goal, to go to the radio station. It's still here, the transmission line to the AM tower. There were some locations that were kind of confirmed as being the site of former bases. There were some locations that were the site of combat bases, but no longer recognizable because of the building of homes and the enlargement of what were then small villages. Most of the Seabees on this trip were pleased to see the economy of Vietnam to be fairly stable. There are quite a few luxury beach resorts in Da Nang, at China Beach and the former Red Beach.
I worked on a 23-mile section of the road, and I was out on that road every day, and I kept remembering that, there was really nothing on either side of that road, and here we were building a 24-foot wide highway to MAC-V class standards, and I said, what in the heck are we building a road like this for? Other than for military reasons, of course, but it was basically a wasteland there. When we came back this time to Quang Tri, I couldn't even find the Quang Tri airfield, which would have been the locus of identifying the rest of it. So every place we've been is absolutely booming, with the one exception of Khe Sanh, of course. But that was a real surprise. I had no concept. Dong Ha in particular, one of my last taskings up here was to put a paved section of the road through Quang Tri, which was about a 3-meter wide dirt road, and I said, who in God's name would waste this money? But orders were orders, so we put our little section of paved road in.
You know, we were up in Quang Tri, and I actually stood on what was the runway of the airstrip. I just had the shakes almost. I stood at Camp Hoover in Da Nang, where I spent probably the last 6 weeks of my deployment. Now, Camp Hoover is now a Vietnamese military base, so we could not get in and walk the ground. But by comparing a picture from 40 years ago to the mountainscape now, I could tell where Camp Hoover was, where the Freedom Hill Exchange was. It was a surreal feeling. It was a surreal time.
There was no airstrip to really maintain, but like, you know what I remember? Detachments going up to Dong Ha and Can Tien, Cam Lo to build the concrete platforms for the artillery, for the 175s. And when those guys come back, there's some horror stories. In '66 and in '68, when I came back, I stepped right into all their nightmares.
Over 100-degree temperatures and 100% humidity brought back many memories for these Navy Seabees, walking through the jungles, in the marshes and wetlands, high in the hilltops were the combat bases, landing zones, and forward observation posts.
I printed military maps, marked the locations, and in some cases it has been helpful to find our destinations, but in most cases any semblance of what was here then is gone, and we really could only get to what we believe is very close or in the vicinity, and that has been good enough.
What there were, the spaces, the places we were at, what did they look like? Realizing that 47 years is a long time between your first remember, and it's of course changed a lot, and we kind of expected that.
47 years later, I expected it to be different, but I thought I could, recognize something, and I guess I did, but it was a pretty big shock because I just thought I'd be able to tell by the terrain where things used to be.
The organization Vietnam Battlefield Tours prepares those returning to Vietnam for the extremes in temperature, the culture that is today the one country of Vietnam, and the types of food that can or cannot be eaten. One huge caution was expressed to those returning to Vietnam was you should not try to cross the street unless you're in full running mode. Motorbikes, motorcycles, and some cars have no respect for pedestrians. The streets of all the cities are crowded with motorbikes.
Even though we haven't, the bases themselves aren't around, some of the other areas that we could visit, we can't touchy-feely things like they did at Normandy and walk the beaches or Iwo Jima and stuff like that. And the reality is that the war has ended. The Vietnamese people have moved on. You can see the progress in the place. The majority of the population of Vietnam is very young. They don't remember the war. They had no connection with the war. And so they greet us as friends, not with, they don't point fingers at us in anger. It's more in humor. It's like, if you travel another country and they know that you're an American, they just say hi and things like that. They've been very friendly, and so that helps in overcoming a lot of some of that anger and realizing that the war has ended for them. They've moved on, and to some respect, they should teach us a lesson about moving on.
And I think it was really good. We had a good group of guys we came with, and we all kind of supported one another at different times, you know, memorials and what was special to them and what they wanted to see. So I think just different memories, seeing Vietnam change and new life and the growth of the country and the people and the friendliness and, you know, actually love you feel from people. You know, we've had some really great experiences here with people. We're all brothers here in this world, so it's time to move on. I think the Vietnamese have moved on. A lot of them mostly are young and they don't really even remember the war or know much about it. So us older people need to move on. I think the people here have more than us Americans.
This has been the greatest trip I've ever seen. I could not believe it. Emotional wise, just to see places that I've been before and to go across these places and see the mountains with vegetation on them, whereas before, when you looked out of Dong Hai, you just seen barren land. Now it's all green.
It's pretty. I didn't think I'd ever be back here. It's pretty cool. It really is. Yeah. Glad this bridge is still here.
I found that you can go back to places that you've been, realizing we weren't going to stay, bringing back some memories of what we did when we were there. For some of the guys, it was a moment of closure.
We remember your name here at the site where so bravely you served and fought with your might. Awarded the Medal of Honor, Marvin Shields, CM3. He gave all. Can do, brave Seabee.
Yeah.
For some of the guys, it brought back some really painful memories, and for some, it just somehow made some of them angrier. The whole project was about memory, was about going back, seeing the things the way they are today, bringing back memories, making us search our memory banks for what did this look like, where was this road, what was located here before. So the whole thing was about memory, and I think if anything, this should prove to many of the Vietnam veterans that it's okay to tell your story. It's okay to remember the good things. It's okay to remember the tough times too, but remember the good things and tell people about it. Document it somehow so that the stories can live on through your family or through your relatives. And this, I hope, this film will let that happen for many. It'll open up doors, it'll open up minds, and it'll open up conversation between Vietnam vets and their families and the general public.
Rest and work for President Nixon in California. AFBN News compiled from commercial and military news agencies. The Army specialist Bob Lawrence. This is AFBN, serving the American fighting man 24 hours a day from the Delta to the DMZ. With transmitters in Quang Tri, Da Nang, Quy Nhon, Pleiku, and Nha Trang. With the Key Network station in Saigon, Vietnam. This is the American Forces Vietnam Network.